The television courtroom was about to witness something that would break the internet and shatter a mother's world forever. Diane Patterson sat in the witness chair with the kind of composed confidence that only comes from years of practice at deception. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, designer blazer, and rehearsed smile projected an image of suburban respectability. But beneath that carefully constructed facade was a woman who had spent 25 years building a house of lies to protect her son, and Judge Judy Sheindlin was about to burn that house to the ground with the cold, hard flames of truth. What happened in the next 8 minutes would become the most viral courtroom moment in television history, shared over 30 million times across every social media platform, dissected by legal experts, and cited by family therapists as the ultimate cautionary tale about the devastating difference between love and enabling. Diane had walked into that courtroom believing she had everything under control. She'd rehearsed her testimony for weeks, memorizing every detail of the alibi she'd constructed for her 28-year-old son Brandon. She'd practiced her sincere expressions in the mirror, perfected the tone of a protective mother who simply couldn't believe her beloved child could do anything wrong. After all, she'd done this before. 3 previous lawsuits, 3 previous testimonies, 3 previous times she'd lied under oath to save Brandon from consequences. Each time she'd walked away feeling like a hero, like the devoted mother who would do anything for her child. She had no idea that this time would be catastrophically different. She had no idea that Judge Judy had spent days digging through court records, security footage, phone records, and bank statements. She had no idea that every lie she was about to tell had already been thoroughly documented and disproven. Most devastatingly, she had no idea that her son's own text messages would expose not just his guilt, but her willing participation in a pattern of deception that had enabled him to prey on innocent victims for years. The case itself seemed straightforward on the surface. Brandon Patterson stood accused of stealing $12,000 from his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Helen Chen, a 73-year-old widow who had made the fatal mistake of trusting the nice young man next door. Mrs. Chen sat in the plaintiff's chair, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched a folder full of bank statements and forged signatures. She looked fragile and exhausted, the kind of tiredness that comes from betrayal by someone you considered family. After her husband died 18 months ago, she'd been struggling with finances and paperwork, overwhelmed by the complexities of managing accounts she'd never handled before. Brandon had seemed like a gift from God, offering to help her organize her bills, understand her statements, and make sure she wasn't being taken advantage of by predatory financial services. He'd visited her home twice a week, sharing coffee and stories, calling her Grandma Helen, bringing flowers on holidays. She'd given him power of attorney over one of her accounts, trusting him completely. Within 3 months, $12,000 had vanished, and Brandon had stopped returning her calls. But this wasn't just about $12,000 or one elderly victim. This case represented something much darker and more disturbing. Brandon Patterson had a history, a pattern of behavior that his mother had been covering up since he was a teenager. At 16, he'd stolen money from his high school's fundraiser, and Diane had blamed the accounting system. At 19, he'd scammed his college roommate out of $3,000, and Diane had paid the roommate back quietly to avoid police involvement. At 23, he'd defrauded a small business owner, and Diane had negotiated a settlement and made the victim sign a non-disclosure agreement. At 25, he'd stolen from a former employer, and Diane had hired an expensive lawyer who got the charges reduced to a misdemeanor. Each time, Diane had swooped in like a guardian angel, using her money, her influence, and her willingness to lie to protect her son from the consequences of his choices. Each time, Brandon had learned the same lesson that he could do whatever he wanted because Mom would always save him. Each time, Diane had told herself she was being a good mother, showing unconditional love, giving her son another chance to change. The truth was far uglier. She hadn't been protecting her son. She'd been creating a monster. Brandon sat beside his attorney looking every bit the innocent victim of mistaken identity. At 28, he'd perfected the art of appearing harmless and misunderstood. His carefully chosen outfit, modest haircut, and practiced expression of wounded confusion would have fooled most people. But Judge Judy Sheindlin wasn't like most people. In her 35 years of jurisprudence, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot liars, manipulators, and sociopaths within seconds of meeting them. From the moment Brandon and his mother walked through her courtroom doors, every alarm bell in her experienced mind had started ringing. The way they exchanged glances, the synchronized timing of their rehearsed story, the subtle body language that screamed conspiracy. She'd seen it all before, but rarely with this level of premeditation and maternal complicity. What made this case special, what had made Judge Judy spend extra hours preparing, was the realization that this wasn't just another fraud case. This was a case about how parental love, twisted and corrupted by fear and control, could transform into something that enabled evil and multiplied suffering. Before we dive into the complete destruction of these lies and watch a mother's carefully constructed world collapse in real time, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in justice and show you exactly what happens when unconditional protection crosses the line into criminal enabling. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with her trademark no-nonsense efficiency, her sharp eyes moving between the defendant, his mother, and the elderly victim who sat clutching her evidence folder like a lifeline. The courtroom had that electric tension that experienced court watchers recognized immediately, the kind of atmosphere that meant something explosive was about to happen. Diane Patterson took the witness stand with the practiced grace of someone who had done this before, her hands steady as she placed it on the Bible to swear an oath she was about to violate repeatedly. She settled into the chair, crossed her ankles in that polished way that suggested country club memberships and charity luncheons, and prepared to deliver the performance she'd been rehearsing for weeks. What she didn't know was that Judge Judy had already reviewed security footage, phone records, and bank statements that would turn every word out of her mouth into prosecutable perjury. "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Judy began, her voice deceptively calm, "you've stated in your written testimony that your son Brandon was with you on the afternoon of March 15th, the day Mrs. Chen's account was accessed and $12,000 was withdrawn. Is that correct?" Diane's response came without hesitation, her voice warm and confident, dripping with maternal certainty. "Yes, Your Honor, that's absolutely correct. Brandon was with me the entire day. We were doing yard work at our home, preparing the garden for spring planting. He never left my sight from 9 in the morning until almost 6 in the evening. There's simply no way he could have been anywhere near Mrs. Chen's bank or her home. I'm his mother, and a mother knows where her child is." The conviction in her voice was remarkable, the kind of certainty that came from years of telling the same types of lies until they felt like truth. She even managed a sympathetic look toward Mrs. Chen, as if to say the poor confused elderly woman must have her dates mixed up. Judge Judy made a show of consulting her notes, flipping through pages while Diane sat there radiating false confidence. The audience watched in fascination as Judge Judy asked follow-up questions, each one seemingly innocent but actually tightening an invisible noose around Diane's neck. "What exactly were you planting that day, Mrs. Patterson?" "Oh, we were putting in tulip bulbs and preparing the vegetable garden beds," Diane answered smoothly. "What time did you break for lunch?" "Around noon, we had sandwiches on the patio." "Did anyone else see you and Brandon during this time?" "Well, no, it was just the two of us, a nice mother-son day together." Each answer came quickly, too quickly, with the kind of perfect detail that suggested memorization rather than genuine memory. Judge Judy's expression remained neutral, but experienced viewers could see the slight narrowing of her eyes, the subtle lean forward that meant she was a predator circling wounded prey. The questioning continued, and Diane's confidence grew with each passing minute. She was actually enjoying this, enjoying the performance, enjoying what she believed was her successful protection of her son. She elaborated on their day together, describing conversations they'd had, the weather, even what they'd watched on television that evening. Brandon sat at the defendant's table, his relief visible as he listened to his mother weave the protective web of lies around him. But as Judge Judy pressed for more specific details about timing, about exactly when they did each activity, tiny cracks began appearing in Diane's story. "You said you worked in the garden all morning," Judge Judy noted. "That's correct," Diane confirmed. "But according to weather records, March 15th was one of the rainiest days of the month in your county. It rained from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. How exactly were you doing yard work in a downpour?" The question landed like a bomb in the courtroom. Diane's face flickered with confusion for just a moment before she scrambled to recover. "Well, Your Honor, perhaps I'm mistaken about the exact date. It might have been the 14th or the 16th. You know how days blur together." Judge Judy's response was surgical in its precision. "Mrs. Patterson, just moments ago you testified that you were absolutely certain about the date, that you remembered it clearly because it was a special mother-son day. Now suddenly the date is unclear. Which is it?" Diane's composure was cracking at the edges, her voice taking on a defensive tone. "I'm certain he was with me one of those days, Your Honor. The exact date might be slightly off, but I know my son, and I know he didn't steal from Mrs. Chen. He's not that kind of person. I raised him better than that. That statement hung in the air like rotting fruit, and Judge Judy pounced on it with the ferocity of a lifetime prosecutor. You raised him better than that? Let's talk about how you raised him, Mrs. Patterson. Judge Judy opened another folder, this one considerably thicker. Are you aware that your son has been sued 4 times in the past decade for fraud and theft? Diane's face hardened. Those cases were all misunderstandings, Your Honor. Brandon was young and made some mistakes in judgment, but he's grown and learned from those experiences. Misunderstandings? Judge Judy's voice could have cut glass. You paid $47,000 in settlements to his victims. That's quite a lot of money for misunderstandings. And in at least 2 of those cases, you provided alibis for your son that were later proven to be false. Would you call those misunderstandings as well? The courtroom had gone completely silent except for the sound of Mrs. Chen quietly crying in her chair. Diane shot her a look of pure irritation, as if the elderly woman's tears were an inconvenient theatrical display rather than genuine pain. Your Honor, I did what any mother would do. I protected my child. I gave him chances to prove himself, to show that he could be better. That's what parents are supposed to do. We don't abandon our children when they make mistakes. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, and anyone who had watched her show before knew what that body language meant. She was about to unleash devastation, and she wanted to savor the moment. Mrs. Patterson, protecting your child and enabling criminal behavior are not the same thing. But we're going to return to that philosophical discussion in a moment. Right now, I want to go back to your testimony about March 15th. You are absolutely, positively certain that Brandon was with you that entire afternoon? Diane, sensing this might be her last chance to maintain the lie, doubled down with renewed conviction. Yes, Your Honor, I am 100% certain. I would stake my reputation on it. A mother knows the truth. Judge Judy smiled, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just heard exactly what they needed to hear. Those words, that absolute certainty, would become the foundation of Diane's complete destruction. Judge Judy reached for the manila folder that had been sitting on her bench throughout the entire testimony, the folder that Diane Patterson had noticed but dismissed as standard court paperwork. The moment Judge Judy's fingers touched that folder, the energy in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Even Brandon, who had been sitting relatively relaxed as his mother wove her protective web of lies, suddenly tensed in his chair. His attorney placed a warning hand on his arm, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Mrs. Chen stopped crying and looked up with desperate hope in her eyes, praying that someone finally believed her after months of being called confused and unreliable. The audience members leaned forward collectively, that instinctive human response to sensing that something catastrophic and unforgettable was about to occur. Judge Judy opened the folder slowly, deliberately, drawing out the tension like a master conductor building to a symphony's climax. Mrs. Patterson, Judge Judy began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to revise your testimony. One last chance to tell the truth before I show this courtroom evidence that will not only prove you're lying but will also result in criminal charges being filed against you for perjury and obstruction of justice. Is there anything you'd like to change about your statement regarding your son's whereabouts on March 15th? The question was a gift, a professional courtesy that Judge Judy rarely extended, and the entire courtroom held its breath waiting for Diane's response. But Diane Patterson, blinded by 25 years of successful deception and convinced that a mother's testimony carried special weight, made the fatal decision to maintain her lie. No, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite the warning signs flashing all around her. I have nothing to change. Everything I've told you is the absolute truth. My son was with me, and I will not let an elderly woman's confusion ruin his life. The phrase elderly woman's confusion was the final straw that shattered any remaining sympathy Judge Judy might have had. Very well, Mrs. Patterson. Let me show you what the absolute truth actually looks like. Judge Judy pulled out the first piece of evidence, holding it up so the courtroom cameras could capture it clearly. This is security footage from Prestige Pawn Shop on Main Street, 3 blocks from Mrs. Chen's home. The timestamp shows March 15th at 2:47 in the afternoon. Does this look familiar? She turned a monitor toward Diane and Brandon, and the entire courtroom watched their faces drain of color simultaneously. The footage showed Brandon Patterson, clear as day, walking into the pawn shop carrying a small velvet bag. The timestamp was irrefutable, the image quality was crystal clear, and there was absolutely no way to claim it was someone else. Brandon's distinctive tattoo on his left forearm was visible, the same tattoo Diane had paid for on his 21st birthday. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. "This is what your son pawned that day, Mrs. Patterson." She held up an evidence bag containing jewelry. 3 pieces that belonged to Mrs. Chen, family heirlooms that her late husband had given her over 40 years of marriage. Her wedding band, her grandmother's brooch, and a necklace that her daughter had worn on her wedding day. "Your son stole these items from Mrs. Chen's home when she trusted him with her house key, and then he pawned them for $850 cash. We have the pawn shop receipt with his signature and his driver's license number." The air seemed to leave Diane's lungs all at once. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, but no words came out. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the way all color had fled from her face, leaving her looking almost gray under the courtroom lights. Her hands, which had been so steady throughout her testimony, now trembled uncontrollably as they gripped the arms of the witness chair. Judge Judy continued her methodical destruction with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. "That's not all, Mrs. Patterson. We also have cell phone tower records that place your son's phone at Mrs. Chen's address at 1:15 that afternoon, at the bank where Mrs. Chen's account was accessed at 2:03, and at the pawn shop at 2:47. We have security footage from the bank showing your son using Mrs. Chen's ATM card to withdraw $6,000 in cash. We have testimony from the bank manager who noticed the unusual large withdrawal and asked to see identification. Your son showed Mrs. Chen's power of attorney document and her identification, claiming he was making the withdrawal on her behalf for medical expenses. But perhaps the most damning evidence of all is this." Judge Judy held up printed pages that looked like text message screenshots. "These are messages between your son and his friend Marcus Delgado, sent the morning of March 15th. Would you like me to read them aloud, or have you figured out yet just how thoroughly you've destroyed your credibility?" Diane's voice finally emerged as barely a whisper. "Please, Your Honor, I can explain." But Judge Judy cut her off with a single raised hand. "You can explain how your son texted his friend saying, and I quote, 'Hitting the old lady's account today, Mom will cover for me like always if anything goes wrong, she's already practicing her testimony.' End quote. Can you explain that, Mrs. Patterson? Can you explain how you and your son planned this deception together? Can you explain how you rehearsed your false testimony while your son was actively stealing from a vulnerable widow?" The words hit Diane like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of her constructed reality. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, and the bailiff had to call for order. Mrs. Chen was openly weeping now, but these were tears of vindication rather than despair. For months she had been told she was confused, that she must have given Brandon permission, that her grief over losing her husband was making her imagine things. Finally, someone believed her, and the proof was irrefutable. But the most devastating blow was yet to come, and it wouldn't come from Judge Judy. Brandon Patterson, the son that Diane had just committed perjury to protect, the child she had sacrificed her integrity and reputation to save, suddenly stood up and spoke words that would haunt his mother forever. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice dripping with entitled rage. "You said this would work, Mom. You promised me your testimony would be enough. This is your fault for not being more convincing." The betrayal in those words was absolute and crushing. In his moment of exposure, Brandon didn't apologize to his mother for putting her in this position. He didn't thank her for trying to protect him. He didn't show any remorse for the lies he'd made her tell. Instead, he blamed her for the failure of their scheme, showing his true nature as clearly as the security footage had shown his face. The transformation that occurred in Diane Patterson in the seconds following her son's betrayal was so complete and devastating that even the most hardened courtroom staff would later say they had never witnessed anything like it. The woman who had walked into Judge Judy's courtroom with her head held high, radiating the confidence of someone who believed maternal devotion justified any deception, suddenly looked like she had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Her son's words, "This is your fault for not being more convincing," hung in the air like poison gas, and everyone in that courtroom watched as the reality of what she had done, who she had protected, and what she had become crashed down on her with the force of a collapsing building. The tears started as just a shimmer in her eyes, a desperate attempt to maintain some shred of composure, but within moments they were flowing freely down her cheeks, carrying her carefully applied makeup in dark rivulets that made her look like a portrait melting in the rain. Brandon's attorney was frantically trying to get his client to sit down and be quiet, but Brandon was too far gone in his own selfish panic to recognize that he was making everything infinitely worse. He continued his tirade, his voice rising with each word. You said Judge Judy was just a TV judge, that she wouldn't have real evidence, that your testimony would be enough to create reasonable doubt. You said we'd practiced this enough that nothing could go wrong. His words were daggers, each one piercing deeper into his mother's heart, each one revealing the calculated nature of their conspiracy. The audience was witnessing something extraordinary and terrible, a public dissection of a corrupted mother-son relationship, the exposure of decades of enabling and manipulation laid bare for millions of viewers to see. Judge Judy sat silent, allowing Brandon to continue his self-destruction because sometimes the most powerful courtroom moments required no intervention, just the space for truth to reveal itself in all its ugly glory. Diane tried to speak, her voice breaking with emotion. Brandon, please stop talking. Please just stop. But her son, the child she had protected at the cost of her integrity, the boy she had lied for, paid for, covered for since he was a teenager, showed her exactly how little her sacrifice meant to him. No, Mom, I'm not stopping. You dragged me into this stupid TV court instead of just paying off the old lady like you did with everyone else. You said you'd handle it, that you'd protect me, and now look what's happened. We're both going to jail because you couldn't sell your story. The cruelty in his words was breathtaking, the complete absence of gratitude or remorse so staggering that even Judge Judy, who had seen every variety of human depravity in her decades on the bench, looked momentarily taken aback. This wasn't just a criminal showing his true colors. This was a monster revealing that he had never been anything else, and that his mother's years of protection had only fed the beast instead of taming it. Judge Judy's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Mr. Patterson, sit down and be quiet before I add contempt of court to your growing list of charges. Then she turned her full attention to Diane, and her expression held something that looked almost like pity, though it was pity mixed with stern judgment. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to look at your son right now. Really look at him. Look at the person you've been protecting all these years. Look at the man who just blamed you for his crimes, who showed no gratitude for your sacrifice, who thinks the problem here is that you weren't a convincing enough liar rather than that he's a thief who preys on vulnerable elderly women. Is this really who you want to destroy your life for? The question landed with devastating impact, forcing Diane to confront a truth she had been running from for decades. She turned to look at Brandon, and for the first time in perhaps his entire life, she saw him clearly without the distorting lens of maternal devotion clouding her vision. What Diane saw destroyed her. She saw a 28-year-old man who still lived in her home, who had never held a legitimate job for more than a few months, who had spent her money and her husband's money and now an elderly widow's money without a single moment of genuine remorse. She saw someone who had learned to weaponize her love, who had figured out at a young age that Mom would always save him and had spent the next 2 decades exploiting that certainty. She saw a predator who targeted the vulnerable, who had stolen from schools and roommates and employers and neighbors, who had taken jewelry from a grieving widow and pawned her dead husband's wedding gift without a second thought. Most devastatingly, she saw someone who was now looking at her not with love or even basic human gratitude, but with contempt for failing to successfully commit perjury on his behalf. The scales fell from her eyes in that moment, and the weight of 25 years of denial came crashing down on her shoulders. Diane's breakdown intensified until she could barely breathe between sobs. Her whole body shook with the force of her crying, and her voice came out in broken gasps. I've ruined everything. I've ruined my life, my marriage, my reputation, my integrity, and for what? For someone who doesn't even appreciate it, who blames me for not being a better liar. Oh God, what have I done? What have I created? The words were barely intelligible through her tears, but everyone in the courtroom heard the raw agony in them, the sound of a woman realizing that her entire understanding of maternal love had been catastrophically wrong. Her husband had tried to tell her for years that she was enabling Brandon rather than helping him, that her protection was making him worse rather than better. She had dismissed her husband's concerns as lack of understanding, lack of devotion to their child. Now she saw that her husband had been right, that every dollar she paid to victims, every lie she told to authorities, every excuse she made for inexcusable behavior had been building blocks in the construction of a monster. Judge Judy allowed the crying to continue for several moments, understanding that this breakdown was necessary, that Diane Patterson needed to feel the full weight of her choices before any lesson could be learned. Then she spoke, her voice carrying both sternness and a kind of tough compassion. Mrs. Patterson, pull yourself together and listen to me very carefully. You came into my courtroom today prepared to commit perjury, to obstruct justice, and to help your son victimize an innocent elderly woman. Your son has shown you exactly who he is and exactly what your years of protection have created. The question now is, who are you going to choose to be moving forward? Are you going to continue being an enabler who helps criminals escape consequences, or are you going to finally be the parent your son actually needed all along, someone who holds him accountable? The silence that followed Judge Judy's question was profound and terrible, broken only by Diane Patterson's ragged breathing as she tried to compose herself enough to speak. Her hands gripped the witness stand rail so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and her eyes, red and swollen from crying, finally lifted to meet Judge Judy's steady gaze. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of a woman who had finally, devastatingly, understood the magnitude of her mistakes. Your Honor, I don't know how to be that person. I've spent 25 years believing that protecting him was the same as loving him. I thought that if I just gave him enough chances, if I just shielded him from consequences long enough, he would eventually become the person I always believed he could be. But you're right. I didn't create a better person. I created someone who thinks stealing from widows is acceptable and blames his mother when he gets caught. I've been so wrong, and Mrs. Chen has paid the price for my failure. Judge Judy nodded slowly, acknowledging the breakthrough without offering false comfort. Mrs. Patterson, recognizing your mistakes is only the first step. The question is whether you're willing to face the consequences of those mistakes and make actual amends, not just feel sorry for yourself. She turned her attention to the full courtroom, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made her a household name. This court finds the defendant, Brandon Patterson, guilty of theft, fraud, and elder abuse. He is ordered to pay Mrs. Helen Chen $12,000 in restitution plus an additional $8,000 in damages for emotional distress and legal fees. Furthermore, I am forwarding this case to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for criminal prosecution. Mr. Patterson, your actions weren't just civil wrongs, they were crimes, and you will face criminal consequences. Brandon's face went from angry red to pale white as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his entitled bubble of self-absorption. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. As for you, Mrs. Patterson, you committed perjury in this courtroom. You came here with premeditated intent to lie under oath, to obstruct justice, and to help your son escape accountability for victimizing an innocent woman. I am also forwarding your case to the district attorney for criminal charges. You will face prosecution for your actions, and I hope that whatever sentence you receive gives you time to reflect on the difference between love and enabling, between protecting and destroying. The words landed like hammer blows, each one driving home the reality that Diane's choices had consequences she could no longer avoid. Her comfortable suburban life, her reputation in the community, her freedom itself were all now in jeopardy because she had chosen to be her son's accomplice rather than his parent. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, not for Diane's suffering, but for Mrs. Chen's vindication. The elderly widow who had been called confused and unreliable, who had been gaslit by both Brandon and his mother, who had spent months doubting her own memory and judgment, finally had official acknowledgement that she had been telling the truth all along. She sobbed openly, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of having her reality validated, of knowing that justice would finally be served. Her daughter, who had flown in from across the country to support her mother through this ordeal, wrapped her arms around Mrs. Chen and whispered words of comfort and vindication. This moment, painful as it was for everyone involved, represented what the justice system was supposed to do: protect the vulnerable, hold the powerful accountable, and shine light on truth no matter how uncomfortable that light might be. As court officers prepared to escort Brandon from the courtroom, Diane made one final attempt to reach her son, standing up from the witness chair on trembling legs and calling out his name. Brandon, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I failed you by protecting you instead of parenting you. I'm sorry I taught you that love meant escaping consequences. I'm sorry I helped create someone who could hurt people without remorse. But Brandon didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her words, didn't show even a flicker of understanding or appreciation for what his mother had finally recognized. He walked out of that courtroom the same way he'd walked through his entire life, convinced that the world was wrong and he was the victim, never once accepting responsibility for the pain he'd caused or the life he'd destroyed. That image, of a son walking away from his mother's desperate apology without a backward glance, would haunt Diane for the rest of her life and serve as the ultimate proof that her years of protection had accomplished nothing except enabling cruelty. The video of this courtroom confrontation exploded across social media within hours of airing. The footage of Diane's testimony, Judge Judy's devastating evidence reveal, Brandon's shocking betrayal of his mother, and Diane's complete emotional breakdown became the most shared courtroom content in internet history. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 30 million times across YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. The hashtag #TruthOverProtection began trending worldwide as millions of parents, family members, and concerned citizens shared their own stories of enabling versus accountability. Parenting forums erupted with discussions about where the line existed between supporting your children and destroying them with unconditional protection. Family therapists used the footage in sessions to illustrate the long-term damage caused by shielding people from the natural consequences of their actions. Legal ethics professors showed it to law students as a stark example of how good intentions could corrupt into criminal behavior when loyalty superseded truth. The aftermath for the Patterson family was swift and merciless. Diane's husband filed for divorce within a week, stating in his papers that he could no longer be married to someone who had valued protecting their criminal son over basic integrity and honesty. He had spent years warning Diane that her enabling was destroying Brandon rather than helping him, and watching her commit perjury on national television had been the final straw that broke their marriage beyond repair. Diane faced criminal charges for perjury and obstruction of justice, eventually pleading guilty and receiving 18 months of probation, 300 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. Her professional reputation in the suburban community where she'd been a respected volunteer and social figure was destroyed overnight, with former friends crossing the street to avoid her and organizations quietly removing her from their boards and committees. The comfortable life she'd built crumbled as legal fees, restitution payments, and the loss of her husband's income forced her to sell their home and move into a modest apartment. Brandon received a sentence of 3 years in prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud, theft, and elder abuse. Additional victims came forward after seeing the Judge Judy episode, and he faced 6 more civil lawsuits from people he had scammed over the years. For the first time in his life, he was forced to face consequences without his mother's intervention, and prison proved to be the harsh teacher that years of gentle second chances had failed to be. Mrs. Chen received her restitution and eventually channeled her painful experience into advocacy work, speaking to senior centers about financial fraud and how to protect themselves from predators who exploit trust and vulnerability. She became a voice for elderly victims, turning her trauma into purpose. 18 months after that devastating courtroom appearance, Diane Patterson began speaking to parenting groups and family counseling centers about her experience. Her message was simple but powerful: real love sometimes means allowing people to face consequences, protection becomes abuse when it harms others, and the hardest thing a parent can do is refuse to save their child from themselves. She spoke openly about her mistakes, about how she had confused unconditional love with unconditional enabling, about how her fear of her son experiencing pain had ultimately caused far more pain than any consequence could have. Her talks were raw and honest, filled with tears and regret, but also with hard-won wisdom about the difference between helping and hurting, between supporting and suffocating, between love and destruction. She could never undo the damage she'd caused, never give Mrs. Chen back the months of gaslighting and self-doubt, never restore the years Brandon had spent becoming a predator instead of a productive human being. But she could use her catastrophic failure as a warning to others, a cautionary tale about what happens when parents choose comfort over character, protection over accountability, and enabling over genuine love. Judge Judy's handling of the case became legendary in both legal and popular culture circles, cited as the perfect example of how truth and evidence could cut through even the most emotionally manipulative deception. Her methodical destruction of Diane's lies, her refusal to be swayed by maternal devotion when that devotion served injustice, and her clear articulation of the difference between love and enabling resonated with millions of viewers who had witnessed similar dynamics in their own families and communities. The case reminded everyone that the justice system at its best doesn't just punish wrongdoing, it exposes truth, protects victims, and sometimes forces people to confront realities they've spent years avoiding. Diane Patterson had walked into that courtroom prepared to lie for her son one more time, convinced that maternal love justified any deception. She walked out understanding that her lies hadn't protected Brandon, they had destroyed him, and that the truth she tried so desperately to hide was the only thing that could have ever set either of them free. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the difference between protecting people you love and enabling their worst behavior, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that real love sometimes looks like letting consequences happen, that accountability isn't cruelty but compassion, and that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the prettiest lie. Comment below about the hardest truth you've ever had to face about someone you loved, or about a time when consequences taught you what comfort never could. Because the lesson of Diane Patterson's devastating courtroom breakdown isn't just about one mother and one son. It's about all of us, about the choices we make between comfort and character, between easy lies and hard truths, between enabling destruction and demanding better. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to protect someone from reality, and sometimes the truth that makes us cry is the only thing that can finally set us free.